Is this seat taken?
I'm not looking for company.
You're in Paris, my friend. In this city, no one drinks alone. So, what are we celebrating?
You're a driver now. You want respect on the circuit? You gotta stop thinking like a mechanic.
We aren't. But if you're keen to get your teeth kicked in, I'll be happy to oblige.
That's enough screwing around. We've got a race to win.
Open your eyes! The war is all around us. You can't escape it. You can hide here and leave the fighting to braver men. Or you can walk out that door and do what must be done. The choice is yours!
By the mid-2000s, Pandemic Studios was on the move. They had gone from virtual unknowns to delivering banger after banger with games like Mercenaries, Destroy All Humans, and Star Wars Battlefront. These games and others cemented Pandemic as one of the most promising developers of the 21st century. It was during this boom period that an idea sprung forth. While on a plane flight, then Pandemic CEO Andrew Goldman was reading a book about William Grover Williams. Williams was a Grand Prix racer who wound up working for Britain's Special Operations during World War II. He established a supply network for the French resistance and continued working with the SOE until 1944, when he was captured by the Nazis and executed the following year. Goldman liked the story and thought it would be a good basis for a World War II action game. He pitched the idea to the Mercenaries team at Pandemic's LA studio. The core impetus was to make a World War II game that didn't feel like a World War II game, making an open-world pulp action-adventure, more akin to something like Raiders of the Lost Ark. The idea was super compelling because it was larger than life, but still grounded in reality. Tom French had finished working on Mercenaries when him and the team were tasked with creating a prototype. Using Mercenaries' Zero engine, they designed a prototype to help greenlight the project. Fun fact, you know that early Saboteur gameplay you can find on YouTube? That's Tom French behind the controller. He said he spent 4 hours trying to capture a perfect playthrough before the big meeting, starting from square one every time he made a mistake. Once the project was greenlit, a small team, including French, was put together to start work on Saboteur.
I see you're a man who'd rather die on his feet than live on his knees.
From the get-go, the team wanted Saboteur to be open world. The bigger task was designing the game. Set in the early days of World War II, you play as Sean Devlin, a mechanic and racer who loves fast cars, fast booze, and fast women. While racing in the Saarbrücken Grand Prix, Devlin gets screwed out of first place by rival racer Kurt Dierker. Sean and his best friend Jules hatch a plan to get back at Dierker. They sneak into the Doppelsieg auto plant and steal Dierker's prized car, the Silver Claw. Unfortunately, they're captured, and Dierker executes Jules after believing the two of them are spies. Sean, along with his mentor Marini and Jules' sister Veronique, narrowly escape to France. Sean spends the subsequent months laying low and getting drunk at the Belle Nuit, until he's approached one night by French resistance member Luc Gardin. Luc offers Sean the chance to get back at the Nazis, which he agrees to.
Well, the resistance could use a good mechanic.
I didn't know there was a resistance in Paris.
That's about to change.
When Saboteur was first conceived, the protagonist was going to be a fictionalized William Grover Williams. But the idea was dropped when they realized the character didn't line up with the game they had in mind. We wanted an everyman, reluctant, anti-hero type character, not directly loyal to any sides of the war, leading us to an Irish protagonist. Also, we wanted this to be an original story, not a story about the war, but the war being the backdrop. This led to the revenge tale, making the player hate the Nazis even more than just as the baddies of history gave us. Thus, Sean was born.
You run into any trouble?
Just the usual groupies, looking for autographs.
Saboteur, aka The Saboteur, features a mixture of shooting, driving, and of course, sabotaging. The team felt it was important to have different gameplay systems that all made an impact on the world. We wanted the players to always have something meaningful to do in and around the mission locations. This led to what we called ambient free play, which you see in the ship game as the side objectives scattered around the world. It creates a lot of little player interactions and stories as they go from point A to B and, like the will to fight, leave permanent impact to the world. The team wanted to show how Nazi occupation had drained the life out of Paris, and how Sean's actions brought life back to the city, which led to the will to fight mechanic. To fully realize this idea, the designers collaborate with the art team to create the game's memorable art style.
You see that man standing over there?
The one grinning like a cat with a cream-flavored arsehole?
He's called Santos. I've seen him at the Bell. He's a black marketeer. He can get what we need.
When you think of the Saboteur, the first thing you think of is the visuals. The black and white mixed with color aesthetic is one of the game's defining aspects, and it was an area the team spent a lot of time on. Christopher Hunt was the game's art director and recalls that nailing the look took a lot of trial and error. They knew the game would have black and white, but would it be the desaturated gritty type or something more stylistic? At the time, the World War II desaturated film style of Saving Private Ryan was prevalent. We wanted to get away from this aesthetic. We used Sin City and film noir as inspiration and ultimately found the right balance. Once that was figured out, next was determining how to meld it with the will to fight concept. Initial plans were more ambitious, with districts gradually regaining their color as opposed to immediately returning to life. But the system was streamlined due to technical limitations. The highlight had to be seeing the black and white melt away and color pop up from the screen. When we first saw that effect, it changed how we thought about what we were doing. This was a game that had visual feedback for progression more than just leveling up or breaking through to a different area, as it was visceral and inspiring.
Tonight we change the course of history, my friend.
Well, all we did is blow up a petrol station.
To design the Saboteur's world, the team traveled to Paris and the surrounding countryside to get as much material possible for the art team to work with. As for the characters, the team took inspiration from various sources. Christopher Hunt remembers certain cast members were based on real-life members of the SOE, but with creative liberties taken when necessary. Jason Hazelroth recalls how he tried to convince the team that Kurt Dierker needed his own car, and when no one bothered doing anything, he made one himself.
Looks like I need to work on my parallel parking.
The character who took the most time to figure out was Sean Devlin. To design his everyman look, the team hired a film costume designer who in turn borrowed one of the developers to try different outfits on. When he came in with the jacket, baggy pants, and the hat, it fit exactly what all of us had been seeing in our head. For his face, we struggled to get the right look for him. When out of the blue, our art director saw someone who perfectly fit the bill at an art convention. He sent us the picture, and seeing him for the first time, I knew I was staring at a real-life version of Sean. Just like the outfit, when everyone else saw the picture for the first time, they knew that was our man.
What's this for? Shaving your legs?
A girl should always carry protection.
Writing duties for the Saboteur were handled by Tom Abernathy. Before joining Pandemic, Tom Abernathy was an aspiring screenwriter trying to get a foot in the gaming industry door. His early work writing game manuals and such paid off when he landed a gig writing dialogue for Destroy All Humans, and in turn getting hired full-time at Pandemic. Once I was done writing Destroy All Humans, Pandemic asked, "Do you want to come on full-time and write Destroy All Humans 2 and this new project we're working on?" And I said, absolutely. They showed me a demo they had made a few months before, and it didn't look dissimilar from what the actual game ended up looking like. The art style was similar. I don't think they had already hit on the idea of throwing Paris into black and white once the Nazis come in. The biggest difference was the player character was a kind of Bobby English guy in Gophers, a Jude Law type. The first thing I did was I turned to them and said, "That's not going to fly. Y'all know that, right?"
And put on airs like some posh wanker with a silver spoon up me arse?
From there, we just sort of rolled, and what was great for me was at first, I was referred to as a staff writer, and pretty soon Tom French made me the writer and the designer. I was not a narrative designer because that term didn't exist yet, but I was basically hired to be a story guy. Tom was responsible for fleshing out the Saboteur, a role he greatly relished. He researched World War II, and in doing so, discovered the conflict was bigger than anyone realized. While learning about the Nazi occupation of France, Tom discovered there were debates amongst the SOE and the resistance about what would happen to France post-Nazi occupation. Some thought France would become democratic, and others thought France would lean more towards communism. The British SOE got nervous and started sabotaging the French resistance. Tom took those conflicting perspectives and melded them into the game's love interest, Skylar and Veronique. I started to think about love interest for Sean, and like the Bond movies, I wanted there to be numerous ones. Like Natalia, I wanted them to be strong and interesting. One should be working for the SOE, the other for the French resistance. And over the course of the game, as the relationship between the two factions begins to fray, so should those two women. They represent a choice Sean needed to make about where he was going to put his allegiance.
Think of it as a job interview. It's time you considered a new line of work.
The first one I came up with was Veronique, who I thought might be the daughter of the club owners and a teacher before the war. She started going to French resistance meetings, and it's how Sean ends up part of the group. Likewise, I decided the other character was like Paris Hilton, but smarter. She initially uses the money to dabble in Playboy-like activities like driving race cars. I like the idea that to set her up as the voice of the SOE, she would be recruited by the SOE to be a pilot. In that way, I could physicalize the unraveling of the SOE and French resistance's relationship with one another. For Sean Devlin, Tom Abernathy expanded the character's blue-collar background. He made Sean someone who's as good at fixing cars as he is driving them. He used Indiana Jones as the basis for Sean's rugged nature. Sean's last name was derived from a character in the Cary Grant film Notorious. Tom knew Sean had to have a reason for hating the Nazis, which is how he came up with Jules and the idea to kill him early in the game, as it would serve as a gut punch to both Sean and the player. I wanted players to get attached to Jules in the little time he's present, and be as charming as he can be, so that when he gets killed, it's as bad for you as it is for Sean.
No! Get away from me! This is your fault! You took him to that place!
Tom Abernathy collaborated with the rest of the team to nail down the game, and it was rewarding because it was how he envisioned game development should be. One instance that stands out in Tom's mind was when an artist needed help designing Skylar's plane. This was the first time anybody had come to me with a question like that, and it hasn't been the last. I loved that he had trust and respect, and he came to me because he needed to know something that only I could provide, because during the 3 years I was involved, I was the only narrative person on the team. At some point, we started talking about how so many planes had art on the side near the front. Often, it was pinup girl style of art, and we loved the idea that if Skylar was into satisfaction of the senses, the art on her plane should reflect that. He goes off, 3 days later, he comes back with the most amazing illustration I have ever seen. It's a cargo plane, but it's stylish. It's got curves, and the art on it was of this pinup guy, and I was like, oh my god, you nailed it, it's perfect.
Fuck me. Skylar?
Are you chatting me up?
Working on the Saboteur was an exciting endeavor. It was an original IP being developed for the then upcoming next-gen systems, and the premise took a familiar setting and gave it a new hook. Each developer I spoke with had their own highlights. For Tom Abernathy, it was getting to be fully involved with the creative process, unlike Destroy All Humans, where he was just writing dialogue. It was an incredibly collaborative process. I can't imagine how it could have been a better introduction for me into what game development should be and look like. I've rarely had that same experience moving forward, although I've tried recreating it when I have the power to do that. Being able to conceive those characters, what their relationships and dynamics were, what they were about, etc., I learned a ton, and it was extremely gratifying.
Tell me, Sean, how did you like your first taste of revenge?
I may give up whiskey.
The Saboteur, in many ways, is the game I have the most heart in. Destroy All Humans sounds more like me, but with the Saboteur, my heart is there, along with Chris Hunt's heart, Tom French's heart, Trey Watkins, and everybody's. We were given a lot of freedom to create a brand new IP out of thin air back when you could do that at the AAA level. It almost never happens now. Our lives now are about making sequels or remakes or reboots, and while that can be gratifying, it's not the same.
I'm a clinical psychiatrist. Do you know what that means?
I don't know.
You like to dress up in women's clothes?
Tom French remembers several moments. Among them was how he was both the lead designer and project frontman, which meant doing press and hyping up how awesome the Saboteur was. The biggest standout for Tom, though, was getting to work with and become best friends with several members of the team, which gave them extra reason to make a great game. It often didn't feel like work. It was getting to hang out with your best friends and create something together that you all loved. That was a feel that was constantly there, pushing and supporting each other. I've gotten to do a lot of big things in my career since Saboteur, but I still look back and cherish those collaborations with the fondest memories. The fact that myself and others are still so close to each other from those days is a real testament to how much we genuinely cared about each other and making this game.
If you are here to bask in my gratitude,
I've come to warn you. Somebody's been talking to the crowds, Luke. You need to call off this crazy plan before it's too late.
That's not to say development was entirely glamorous. This being an open world game, there was the challenge of creating a massive sandbox within technical constraints, as was making sure the game's scope wasn't overstuffed. Trying to fit the scale of the world, assets, etc. into memory was always a balancing act for the entire time. We had to build 9% of the technology we used to create the game, which means we were often building the plane while flying it. Making a game in black and white is no easy task. I think in some ways it was tougher than getting the color to look just right. There was a lot of back and forth with the graphics developers. For Tom French, the biggest challenge was figuring out what mechanics worked best. All of the mechanics went through a lot of iterations as we kept moving the game forward. Some for the better, some for the worst. A good example is at one point we had it so going from melee to gunplay was as simple as holding the left trigger. Positive of this was it was more fluid to transition between fistfights and gunplay, putting more balanced emphasis on melee as an option and creating more emergent moments. Playing the game in the past year after it was released on Steam, there's lots of little decisions I can see that I wish we'd done something different with or put more priority into improving. It's rare you ship a game where everything is as polished as you want to release it, especially a game with a lot of features competing for attention.
Curiosity killed the cat, Mr. Devlin. The same may be said for indiscreet Irishmen.
Tom Abernathy remembers that early on, the team was understaffed and wasn't as focused on hitting development milestones, which meant asking for extensions to get things done. Although development was collaborative, sometimes there were conflicts of interest regarding what the game was. Tom Abernathy envisioned the Saboteur as a pulpy adventure in the spirit of Indiana Jones and James Bond, while the director wanted something with a little more grit to it. A good example is the Belle Nuit, the burlesque nightclub Sean hides out at. The director wanted there to be a brothel. Sorry, wrong word, I meant burlesque house. This was where our disagreements about the tone began to rear its head. I had been to Paris when I was 14. My dad was stationed in Germany and we took a weekend trip to Paris. My parents, for reasons I can't explain, took my sister and me to both the Moulin Rouge and Les Americains. It was quite a long weekend for 14-year-old me since I had never experienced anything like that. I went about making the burlesque house as nice and non-threatening as I could, just because of my memories of those two places. It was Sean's home base, and I knew it needed to be a place that felt safe.
I wouldn't expect to find a man of the cloth in a place like this.
About 3 years into the project, Tom Abernathy left. The reasons why were both personal and professional. Chief among them was the recent buyout of BioWare and Pandemic by Electronic Arts. EA buying Pandemic was a big part of the reason as to why I left. I remember that morning the news broke. We didn't know anything about it. We were totally blindsided. The morning the sale became public, I got an email from a friend of mine and mentor, Susan O'Connor, who's a legendary writer, narrative designer. The email said, "Congratulations, I have 2 pieces of advice for you. Get yourself a money person who can talk about possible stock options and start making an exit plan." She had been through this before and knew what was going on. With Tom Abernathy gone, new writers were brought on to fill in the gaps. Several devs I spoke with said the story stayed the same, but some of the dialogue was changed and a couple of new characters were added.
People are getting killed out there, Mom. What's so damned important about a bunch of paintings?
During the Saboteur's development, Electronic Arts bought out Fiji Holdings for $860 million in late 2007. Unlike Mercenaries 2, where the publisher was quite hands-on, they were more hands-off with the Saboteur, though that changed as development wrapped up. Towards the end, they brought on an executive producer to help get us over the finish line. I can't honestly say I could point at any big impact this made, besides his occasional presence in an office in the corner looming over us and maybe keeping us more focused towards closing down. EA mandated the Saboteur ship with some sort of pre-order bonus, which is how we got the Midnight Club DLC. This was a code that gave you a full frontal view of the Belle Nuit's clientele, as well as a new weapon and vehicle for Sean. The DLC's risque nature spurred controversy, and its inclusion wasn't one the team agreed with. All the negative sentiment towards the pre-order DLC was 100% valid. I always thought it was cheesy. It just felt goofy, not the nudity, but the cheap strip club vibe, being promoted as a sex sales kind of encouragement to buy the game instead of renting it. I hated getting press questions about it because I had to wear a smile and divert attention around it.
Right then. I don't like you, and I trust you even less. I'm only here because of what you said about Jules.
In late 2009, Electronic Arts announced Pandemic Studios was closing. Though the studio had flourished during the 6th generation, they stumbled into the next generation. The cancellation of high-profile projects like The Dark Knight, the less than stellar success of Mercenaries 2, and the stinging effects of the global recession contributed to the studio's closure. EA shuttered Pandemic Brisbane in early 2009 before closing the Los Angeles studio later that year. I remember after Pandemic was closed, EA contracted me to do some additional promotion for the game. Despite having weird reservations about helping EA any further, I awkwardly signed up because I still cared about the Saboteur. While it was good to give our boy Sean a last hurrah, it led to a lot of loaded questions about the studio closure and the bearing of the game, which I wasn't really allowed to talk about, mainly just diverting back to how much we loved making the Saboteur.
Marvelous. You are a man of extraordinary resources, Mr. Devlin. I could use a man like you.
The developers felt EA's lack of support for the Saboteur contributed to its commercial failure. The game now has a loyal following, but at the time, the game's mixture of World War II and open world mayhem wasn't an easy sell, especially since it was a new IP. We could tell we were not a priority on EA's schedule, and we felt like our game was sent out to die. It's strange to imagine, but often some projects are not supported by corporate agendas. I can't prove it, but I feel the merger with EA was really meant for BioWare, not Pandemic, which is why Pandemic was quickly disbanded after the Saboteur's release.
Be reasonable, Luke! They only want you and the girl! The others are free to go!
You're done making deals, you Judas bastard!
It was clear EA had no intention of keeping Pandemic alive past the point the Saboteur got out the door, and they weren't going to put any resources into marketing, which is a shame because if they had, I think it could have done a whole lot better than it did. Sometimes, the business arm of a game publisher or studio doesn't know how to sell something that doesn't have anything that came before it, or something to point to and say, it's going to be this kind of experience. It can be problematic from a marketing point of view. I prefer to think of it as rather than something problematic, there's an opportunity for something to say to the public. This is a game that is unlike any you've played before, and a world unlike any you've played before, and lean into the fact it's original.
I was wrong about you, Devlin. We'll make a hero out of you yet.
I've discussed how the Saboteur evolved throughout development, and with a project this big, some ideas ended up on the chopping block. Sean was going to have various short-term love interests, including a fling with a singer named Georgia Parker. She was based on the French-born singer and actress Josephine Baker. They got as far as casting Cree Summer for the role, but she was cut. The original finale saw Sean infiltrating Castle Valhalla to stop Baker and the Nazis from nuking Paris. There are a few Saboteur builds floating around that feature a rough version of Valhalla and the surrounding town side. The ending was reworked when they realized they wouldn't have enough time to fully implement everything. Remember the SS She-Wolf Francisca? You don't? It's this one. She was going to have a larger part, to the point they had started work on her boss fight, but her role was downsized to keep the game's already massive scope in check. Early on, the team planned on setting the game across all of France and even parts of North Africa, but they scaled it back to Paris due to scope and hardware limitations. Other ideas considered included flyable planes, destructible cover, and letting Resistance members tag along with Sean by honking your horn. They wanted to include more supernatural elements, but they nixed it to keep it as grounded as possible. Several DLCs were planned to explore Sean's backstory, and yes, there were talks of a sequel. Its genesis began near the end of the Saboteur's development, when lead asset artist Joe Myers began compiling material and ideas for the sequel. He even created a rough version of Berlin running on the Saboteur's engine. Our art assets lead called me to his office a couple of months before we shipped with a fully realized section of Berlin running in-engine, new gameplay ideas, and a booklet detailing concepts for the story and world. It was really cool, and I remember leaving his office feeling inspired about the things he'd showed me, itching to figure out how to make this world happen.
Have you lost your nerve?
I fell for hours!
The Saboteur released on December 8th, 2009 to decent reviews. Critics praised the game's originality and unique art style, but criticized its lack of polish, among other things. It's unclear how well the game sold. BG Chart says lifetime sales, at least on consoles, peaked at 500,000 units. Although the developers look back fondly on making the Saboteur, their feelings about the game's initial reception were more mixed. I have a lot of weird sentiment about the release of this game. After EA shut us down and before Saboteur even hit shelves, it was publicly obvious they didn't have any faith or hope in the game, which I think tainted players' and journalists' perception of it. We knew it wasn't perfect, but you could feel the love that went into it when you played it. I was surprised. I think the game won an artistic award at E3 that year. Maybe it was the best art direction, I can't recall, but that was a hard-earned victory and well-deserved, especially for the graphics programmers. They had an enormous challenge and delivered. EA marketing, on the other hand, not so much. But that was the last title in a long string of games made at Pandemic, so I'm glad it ended on a high note.
I'll see you at the victory party!
I don't remember what the critical reception was, to be honest with you. Once a little time had passed, people began to remember it more positively. Word started getting around, but by that point, it was too late to save it, and Pandemic was gone. There was no point talking about it. I guess if it had been a huge hit, EA could have tried to hire some of the team back to make a Saboteur 2, or just hire an all-new team. I do think that, as happens, EA failed us.
Son of a bitch!
I discovered Pandemic Studios and their games about a year or so after their closure. I played the hell out of the Mercenaries and Destroy All Humans series, but the Saboteur eluded me until a few years ago. I bought the game at a con, tried it out, and put it on my shelf to gather dust.
Not exactly true love, then.
It was a huge mistake, I know, because the Saboteur is a damn good game. It draws you in with its remarkable aesthetics and hooks you with its action-packed gameplay. The Saboteur oozes personality. While there had already been a couple of games that had tried a similar visual approach, they pale in comparison to the Saboteur. It's not just cool visuals, they highlight the contrast between oppression and liberation. Areas under Nazi occupation are bleak. Goose steppers patrol around every corner. Citizens are harassed or held at gunpoint, and propaganda blasts out of speakers 24/7. As you take back Paris, those oppressed areas return to life. There's fewer Nazis and more resistance. Pouring rain and thunder gives way to sunny vistas and starry nights. It's impressive how seamless the transition is between the two color schemes. But this game isn't just a looker, it's a fun experience.
Now if you'll excuse me, I've a train to catch.
The Saboteur's Mayhem reminds me a lot of Red Faction Guerrilla. Both games are about taking down an oppressive enemy. In Red Faction Guerrilla, you do this by destroying buildings and caving in skulls with a sledgehammer. The Saboteur opts for a subtler approach. It's fun waltzing into an enemy base and sabotaging equipment when no one's looking. Sure, you could beeline through the story in 5 or 6 hours, but then you miss out on what makes the Saboteur so damn fun. I also like the game's premise. The revenge story is nothing new, but the Ryan characters are charming. Sean Devlin reminds me of Crypto in the sense he's a smartass who could care less about most people, but the further the plot progresses, the more he takes things seriously. The side characters like Luke or Veronique are also memorable. The villains, not so much. Kurt Dierker is an atypical antagonist. He works in terms of getting the player to hate him, but that's about it.
I've no taste for German cuisine.
It's also clear some parts of the story were heavily trimmed. Francesca is set up to be Dierker's right-hand lady, only to have a quick cameo and vanish for the rest of the story. The game teases that the Nazis are researching nuclear weapons, but instead of an epic showdown at Castle Valhalla, we shoot up a reactor and that's it. I do like the game's ending. Spoilers ahead, but after returning to Paris, Sean reaches the Eiffel Tower to discover Dierker has snapped. The resistance has overthrown the Nazis and he's started executing his own men. The final confrontation isn't a big boss fight, rather a subdued one-on-one between Sean and Dierker. The game ends with Sean coldly staring out at Paris, indicating he's a changed man, but not necessarily for the better.
Killing you could never make up for what I've lost. My friends will still be dead, and I'll still have to live with the things I've done.
The Saboteur isn't perfect. Blowing up Nazi structures loses steam after a while, and the melee system, while in depth, is rendered pointless because you have guns. Why waste time trying to chuck goose steppers off buildings when you can blast them in the face? The stealth system is a great concept with an iffy execution. I understand enemy officers being able to break Sean's cover, but why would casually walking around raise a soldier's suspicion? Issues aside, I had a blast with this game. It's a World War II game with a fresh perspective, and ironically, it's a better Mercenary sequel than the Mercenary sequel we got. You've gunned down Nazis before, but you've never done it in a world as slick and stylish as the Saboteurs.
This just isn't your day.
You were the only one who ever escaped. It is fitting that you should be the one.
I won't argue with that.
The Saboteur was Pandemic's unofficial swan song, and though it wasn't initially a success, its legacy has grown stronger with each passing year. The Saboteur's re-releases on GOG and Steam have introduced new gamers to this forgotten gem, and it's left the team satisfied knowing where the game stands now versus where it did back in 2009. I think it's great people still enjoy playing this game. I think part of its longevity is its art and gameplay, but also because the Saboteur hits that cult classic vibe. That's what Pandemic looked for back then. Someone didn't need to be the best at one thing, but have the passion to make great things and follow their instincts to grow as an artist, designer, or programmer. A lot of our own personalities are channeled into the game in some form or another, and the team, while enormous, was a close group. I have a working theory that's partly because it tanked, it wound up in bargain bins. A lot of people grabbed it on a whim because it was cheap enough for a young player to pay with using their scraps of cash. I think these players are now grown-up gamers and looking back at it with fond memories. They discovered something that, despite being rough around the edges, has its own charms that are very distinctly Saboteur. While I think we all wish it wasn't our swan song, and the thing we poured ourselves into had been more of a surprise hit rather than a cult hit, honestly, I love its cult status. I love seeing players obsess over it online.
How do you feel, Mr. Devlin?
I could eat a nun's arse through a convent gate.
I see.
But I'll settle for that case of scotch.
Obviously, it's disappointing EA clearly planned to tank it, then sell the company or break it up. And it's sad, but we were all comforted by the fact that in 2009, there were lots of lists of the games you never played this year that had the Saboteur on them. I've had on multiple occasions people reach out to me, or when they hear that I worked on it, tell me, "Oh my god, I love that game, it's amazing." And they want to talk about it. They want to hear about it, and it's meaningful to all of us. There's nothing more gratifying as a creative person than seeing that your work has connected with people, that it's added something. It's added meaning to their life.
Oh, I never quit while I'm ahead. And right now my luck's running hot.
Pandemic Studios was a breeding ground for new talent. Everyone I spoke with said Pandemic helped shape them into better game developers. I learned about game development, Tom French taught me about game design, and I had 2 different experiences working with teams in the form of the Destroy All Humans team in Brisbane and the Saboteur team in LA. The Brisbane folks I didn't get to spend as much time in person with. The Saboteur team was different in that I was embedded with them the whole time for 3 years. For writers, when you get put onto a design team and are around them all day, it's quite different if you're used to working alone in a room with no noise. I got a ton of experience working with voiceover actors and adapting my skill set to be really specific with working them in the most effective way and what they can bring to the process. Many others and I around me really grew up and cut our chops at that studio. From the outside, with the game's pandemic released, you could feel they were aiming to do something with their own unique flavor. We may have not hit the same stars as the big games of that era, but you could tell the developers were aiming for them. Building a team around this sense of family and collaboration isn't something that's always part of the culture of studios. It's hard and takes a lot of effort, more than I think I realized at the time. But it's that sense of team that I want to always strive for where I work. My key takeaways from my time at Pandemic is passion for your craft is fragile, and don't let folks delude or make you second guess your abilities. That's what made Pandemic unique, as there was more of a lift-up mentality with the team and management. We all leaned on each other for encouragement and would learn on the fly exploring different ideas. Making a game takes a team that has allowed creative exploration, and that is what Pandemic Studios did so well. It was more than a game studio, and for a time, it was the only place I wanted to be.
You've done it! Oh, seeing her again is like finding a lost child.
She's still hell on wheels. The crowds were reluctant to part with her.
As for Sean Devlin, Tom French feels we haven't seen the last of him. I keep hoping I'll get the call that it's time to fire up the Aurora again, or work with the right person who can get in the ear of the right EA exec that we need another Saboteur. It's a hope I still keep alive. And if I know were to happen, there's a good-sized team of developers who would instantly drop everything to come back together just to give our boyo another run of it.
Is it over?
No, it's not over. I'm just getting started.
This has been the complete history of the Saboteur. As always, I want to give a huge thanks to everyone who agreed to be interviewed. A huge thanks to Tom French for helping me get in touch with some of the developers who I spoke with for this project. It took a lot of time and effort, but I'm satisfied with how it turned out. I learned a lot about the making of the Saboteur, and I hope you did the same watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, because the year is still young and I'm only getting started. Thank you for watching.